Sure, sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Punajit,
Sure.
Pratyusha, and Dr. Mohua for the warm invitation. I honestly have nothing to share because I'm not, have any kind of PowerPoint presentations, and mostly I am more fond of verbal deliberations and storytelling. Um, Once again, thank you so much, all of you, for the warm invitation. And I'm really glad to be here with all of you virtually and very much looking forward to share my thoughts with all of you and looking forward to your perspectives as well. Uh, as I have shaped my presentation today as Garbo, Politics and Media, before I move into the nitty-gritties of this particular topic, I would actually like to share with all of you what exactly is Garbo-Politics and why do we really need to, put our minds together to think around this, would be my initiating point of my presentation. So to break the word Garbo-Politics is what I understand as the politics of garbage or the politics of waste. Um, Now, those of you are very much rigorously working in interdisciplinary spaces. I am kind of presuming that you are also aware that we are having these fields that have come up like discard studies, critical waste studies, post-human studies, and post-Anthropocene studies, and many other similar, very interrelated fields of research. Now, one of the many reasons behind the evolution of these particular spaces is to is kind of emerging out of this concern towards our natural environment. It's obviously needless to sit here and justify that to what extent the tremendous damage our human activities, our capitalistic activities, our self-profiting activities have already caused to the natural environment. And engaging with the natural environment, thinking about the natural environment for the welfare of the natural environment to ensure the prevention of the further destruction of the natural environment is not new. Endless number of pacts have been signed, endless number of pledges have been undertaken, so many activisms have taken place across the world, so many policies have been framed. But then the fundamental question is, in spite of generating so much of awarenesses and concerns and policies and initiatives, instead of any improvement, what we have been observing, and if we are also taking into account the various statistics that we have at hand, that there has been a consistent declination in the conditions and the state of the natural environment, and which is obviously affecting the human civilization as well. Now, these are the questions, these are the perspectives that I'm sharing with you, is in a way I'm trying to think out aloud with all of us. And these are also some of the questions that have been concerning me for quite some time now, which eventually have provoked me to engage with the aspect of waste slash garbage, not just as it is in the form of physical entity, not just garbage as something as physical objects that we are daily producing and disposing of, whether from the industries, from the factories, or from the homes, or from individuals. But garbage, if we do a sort of critical investigation, we would very deeply understand that garbage is not just a physical entity. It's deep down ideological, it's political, it's emotional, it's cultural, and in various other aspects that garbage get presented in our life. Now, how and why and in what ways, obviously, eventually, as we go ahead, we would unpack. And this kind of experience, obviously, this sort of thinking process emerges from a multiple set of experiences. Some of those experiences are very personal, some of those experiences are very collective. Now, let me start, although in my, when I was asked to share an abstract, I outlined in the abstract that I would be citing examples from Bangalore and Varanasi, but I think it's essential that I start from my own hometown. In fact, from my very own locality where I stay, right? I think that would make more sense to start off with. So I stay in North Kolkata. Those who are familiar with the city of Kolkata, they might be also familiar with places like Shambazar and Belgachi and all of these locations. So I stay in this location of North Kolkata where uh, every day when I would wake up, like obviously prior to moving out of my home for studies and for my workplace, for my job, whenever I would wake up in the morning, the first thing I would like to do is to go to the balcony and try to look outside. And every day I would be welcomed by a set of disgusting sight. And the disgusting sight would be like the moment I look out of my balcony down into the streets, I would see that it's full of plastic packets, stinking garbage all around the streets. All around the streets. Like every homes, every buildings, all of these buildings, in front of the buildings, you will find heaps of stinking plastic packets. Interestingly, thrown by the people, who are residing in those locations. Now, as on the one side, I felt very physically disgusted, visually disgusted, aesthetically disgusted, because obviously, I mean, none of us, I believe, would like to wake up to such a kind of sight every morning, right? It also sort of made me start questioning that why would somebody like to do something in front of their own homes which is deep down unhygienic and disgusting? What could be the reasons? I mean, if I am a very crooked person, probably I will try to destroy somebody else's home or somebody else's aesthetics. Why would I do it in front of my own home, right? And this is one of the many questions that actually have provoked me to understand the narrative, the phenomenon of producing, accumulating, and producing waste in a very wider framework. And that wider framework, as I already mentioned briefly right at the beginning, consists of the cultures behind the accumulation and disposal of garbage, consists of the factors like caste and race and religion and politics and how do they contribute in the shaping of the garbage. I also remember, and this is again for me was more disturbing and more alarming, apart from seeing the people right from our neighborhood throwing waste right in front of their own homes. It was also quite disturbing to see how the local municipality cleaners, they would clean domestic waste from different localities and would often use my locality where I would stay as a sort of a dumping zone. Like just imagine, like throughout the day, I would be, if I'm at home on a holiday, I would, my own room opens up to the balcony and that opens up to the street. I would basically see that these municipality cleaning vehicles, they are coming and they're dumping these waste, like waste from used mattresses from hospitals, from shops, all of those waste materials which are deep down unhygienic, unhealthy, obviously essential sources of spreading different sorts of bacterial diseases, airborne diseases around, are just being dumped onto right into the middle of the street. And those are like proper, it's not like even narrow streets lying in some interior corners. It's like open public streets where consistently people are using for walking and driving and all of these perspectives. And when it was raised with the municipal corporation, all of these challenges, they didn't pay any heed to our complaints because apparently, obviously, it was not officially mentioned, but the unofficial undertone was that because our locality didn't vote for the ruling government, and that is why we are being penalized, we are being punished in that same way. So, where you see, when you take this narrative, when we all take this narrative into consideration, we see that waste not just becomes or remains as an object anymore. Waste not just becomes like an just a casual random object of accumulation and disposal, but it becomes a very essence of politicizing ideologies and perspectives. It becomes a resource, a tool for playing out politics. And this is, I'm starting off with my locality, but I'm sure these are the similar kind of or different other forms of ways of, understanding or using waste to politicize certain perspectives, certain ideologies, and certain knowledge systems are quite common. There are even ample of examples where people will not allow intruders or invaders to come into the locality, and to prevent them from coming into the locality they will dump garbage in front of the locality so that people feel disgusted or vehicles cannot come in. So there have been ample of these examples across India and the world where waste has been used for multiple ways and forms and formats, and as a form of regularity, as a form of entity for regulating our ways of thinking and doing in daily life. And that these are some of the factors that actually provoked me to shape up this idea of garbo politics, or the politics of garbage, or garbage like politics. Now, also, let me tell you that this is actually a very complex concept. This is a very complex perspective. It is very multi-layered. At points of time, it is very confusing. So obviously, I mean, in due course, if you feel in that way that it's very confusing, or you're unable to sort of draw a very fixed set of conclusions out of these narratives, that's perfectly fine, because the whole purpose of generating this perspective is to understand that when we are talking about the environment, we are trying to look into reducing waste production in our daily life. When we're looking into waste production in our daily life, we also have to deep down investigate the different factors that actually cause the essential production of waste on a daily basis. And when we investigate those factors, usually we see that our tendencies are to restrict our investigation or restrict our findings within very mechanical dynamics. Like, okay, industries are producing waste, humans are producing waste, factories are producing waste, or digital objects are producing waste. But we don't really take into account the question of culture, that how cultural knowledge systems can produce waste. Or we don't really take around the question of media, or how media as a platform can also play an essential role in producing waste. And for that reason is where we have to take into account the garbo politics of waste. Now, coming to the questions very specifically now, having given this background, coming to the question of media right now, is how media plays an essential role in further incentivizing the politics of garbage or garbo politics. Now, obviously, media again is a very extremely diverse and complex platform, and I mean, for sure, we just cannot cover anything and everything within this restrictive period of time. But then, some of the aspects of media that I'm trying to showcase is the social media. Now, the social media platform, now we can take ample of examples. We can take Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or any other, or I mean, X handle or any other sort of social media that we are using in our daily life. Now, when when actually, initially when we were trying to raise this with the going back to the same old story, when we were trying to raise this concern with the municipality, and they right away ignored us, and we knew the underlying reason, because similar sort of complaints were raised from adjacent localities as well, but they were very quickly resolved, unlike our sort of scenario. We tried to attract the attention of the social media, the news media, to find out if this can be put out into the newspaper and can be highlighted, if at least that can draw the attention of the higher authorities. And interestingly, it was never done. It's not that they were not aware of it, or they did not know what was happening. Because photographs were sent, the situation was well alerted, and they even promised that they would be coming and taking photographs, and also and obviously going back and highlighting it in the newspapers. But it was never done. Multiple, even after multiple level of follow-ups, even after multiple level of um, finding out emails and calls. Nothing really was done in that part. But it's not that the media doesn't highlight these kind of issues. Obviously the media highlight these kind of issues. We see that they would often highlight how waste accumulation is a problem in certain localities across the state. Even if I take example of just West Bengal, or even if I just take the example of Kolkata, just the one particular city of Kolkata from where I come from, there you see that every day waste is a major problem, no matter from whichever corners of the city we come from. Dumps of waste, choked local lakes and river bodies, and piles, heaps of mountains of garbage being put out right away in the corner of the street, attracting multiple levels of diseases and all sorts of problems, is a very common thing in a city like Kolkata, and also in many other metropolitan cities, I believe, across the country. But then the question is, why would the media or in the social media only certain parts of the city get highlighted? Now, when we deeply look into or investigate that prior to, and not just when, not just which parts of the city is getting highlighted, but also the bigger question is the timeline, the point of time when that sort of highlighting is being done. These are the questions that itself launches us into the whole narrative of the politics and the propagandas that actually erupt or emerge around the perspective of waste, probably because of prior to an election, or the newspaper wants to sort of criticize a particular politician, but probably because of ethical concerns it cannot do directly, so that particular municipalities poor waste management situations would be highlighted. Or on a lot of occasions, when when a particular locality is being consistently filled with garbage, so that prior to the election, that particular locality or the political leaders of those particular locality can be sort of shown in bad light at the cost of highlighting political leaders from other localities. In fact, I have some examples in the, especially with regards to this very perspective, I have some interesting examples from Varanasi, which I would come a bit later. But then, the timeline, the time period when they highlight is also usually before the elections, during the elections, after the elections, and then all of a sudden there is a complete stop. No one really cares. No one really bothers. And when we take into these observations and these very categorical perspectives into account, we very clearly can observe that it has its real intention is not really to highlight the problem of waste in general, but rather to politicize waste, to use it as a tool in order to defame a particular person or a particular political party or a particular cultural entity or a religious entity. Or it is also a way of sort of turning the cards for the vote banks. And in this case, I'll actually, as I said earlier, that I'll cite this example, very specific example from Varanasi, because and that is another place I stayed there for 10 years. So very closely I know kind of every corner of the city. Now, usually the location where I used to stay in Varanasi, it was very much near to my university. And the locality was mostly habituated with people from the Dalit community and the Muslims. Now, interestingly, that the location, and it is essential to mention these religious and the caste dynamics very categorically here, because they play an essential role in framing the argument around the question of Garbo-Politics and media. Now, what would happen is, and that particular locality was very much in the deep interiors. So if you're walking down the main street, obviously you do not get a hold, or you do not get a chance to view those localities until and unless you are going there for a particular work. And then that sort of locality, consisting of the Dalits and the Muslims, was widely embroidered by the very posh localities of the high caste Hindus, let's say mostly the Brahmins. Now, interestingly, what would happen is again, that same sort of very interesting experience, not exactly ditto same, but kind of identical experience what I had in Kolkata, is where the locality of the Dalits and the Muslims, and also where I used to stay as a student rentee, would be used as openly as dumping zones, would be used as dumping zones where people from adjacent localities, I've seen like people coming, driving bike through this locality, holding bunch of plastic packets, just randomly hurling it out into the street, which probably they will never ever do this back in their own locality. Now, here, what happened is this observation consistently provoked me, triggered me to think that why would certain localities again or certain spaces would be treated as by default dumping zones, or can be simply treated as where people can dump their waste and go off, right? So this narrative of dumping zones obviously is not just something which is very casual, which is very spontaneous. It has to also do with how certain communities, certain cultures, certain cultural, religious, caste, and racial affiliations have been historically treated as waste. I mean, in fact, obviously, this is not the first time somebody's claiming it. There is a whole entire literature that exists. I mean, we can talk about Zygmunt Bauman's wasted lives. We can talk about. In fact, let me put the names in the chat box so that we are all able to access it. Just a moment. So yes, this is Zygmunt Bauman's wasted lives. Then there is Asa Doron's book Waste of a Nation, which is very much focused on the plight and the pains and the agonies of the rag pickers in India. And then obviously the authors, they actually associate their plight not only with their profession, but how the profession is also connected to their very discardable caste belongingness as well. So this sort of intersection is not new. Like where waste is not just a physical entity, but waste is also associated with caste belongingness, cultural belongingness, knowledge systems, religion, and all of these factors. But the unfortunate part is, despite the knowing this fact, or despite the fact that we are engaging with them very rigorously within our different forms of knowledge making paradigms like waste studies and discard literature and all of these things, we are hardly able to bring some practical transformations in the process. And again, that is where this whole narrative of Garbo politics, in fact, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I'll just do one thing. I'll just give you a link first, and then I'll tell you why I'm giving you the links. Because this particular perspective of Garbo-Politics widely emerges from a very recently published work of mine. It's called Garbocracy. And if you want to access the work, I'm just sharing you the ResearchGate link from where you can download the PDF here. So that is where garbocracy, or vested forms of government policies, very wasted forms of attitude of one group of humans towards another, and also towards the natural environment, or other forms of approaches that are deep down disgusting, stinking, nauseating, and extremely wasteful, just like heaps of garbage, right? And that is, again, I would see that how going back to the story of Varanasi, I would see often how these kind of these localities, they would not just come and dump all the waste and garbage, but the people from those localities will never raise their voice and resist. And then obviously when you stay in a locality, you end up being close to the local people, and you often ask them that why don't you ever resist or protest, and they would tell you their agonizing stories, that how on a daily basis they are reminded that because of their so-called marginalized caste belongingness, because of their so-called marginalized religious belongingness, they will actually not be treated as humans. They are regarded as someone who are not essential, who are not. And then we had multiple challenges. We would have water facilities, issue with water facilities. We would have issue with electricity supply. When you will see, often it would happen when some kind of notable, so-called notable political leaders will pass through or parade through those roads in the evening. They want to make sure that the electric power supply has deeply improved in the city. So what they will do is they will make sure that the power supplies internally are cut off, so that in the main locations, and let's also read this word main as equivalent to the high caste residential locations, they are fully lighted, they have they have full access to power supply. And then the political leaders who are parading down the street or walking down the street, they see that, wow, how greatly the electric supply of the city of Varanasi has improved. Whereas we knew the reality, because we would be staying, and many people like us knew the reality, because we would be staying internally. And in fact, this became such a system for us, this became such a process for us, that we would even tell jokingly to our friends that, okay, this so and so political leader is coming tomorrow. It means that there will be another 4 hours, 5 hours power cut in our locality, because obviously that power has to be taken away from there and supplied to these so-called posh, elitist, high caste locations. So when you read between the lines, now see, no one tells you that. No, book of ethics or a blue book or green book tells you that. But when you start investigating the patterns, when you look at the specialities of the patterns, when you look at the movements of the patterns, when you look at the regulations of the patterns, it doesn't become really very difficult to feel. And then obviously you talk to the people, you engage with them, you listen to the different sorts of concerns that were raised by them from different points of time, and how they were never heard properly. So when you start tying up these loose ends together, you realize that this all are very deep down interconnected, where the waste as a physical object, becomes cobwebbed, intertwined with community identities, becomes intertwined with cultural identities, becomes intertwined with political identities. And then you see none of these things are reflected on the media. None of these things are reflected on the media. You can take instances from the newspapers which are locally published. If you look at these sort of instances, what you basically see is they would talk about how the power supply has improved in some of these very posh locations across the city. But then they never talk about how some of the locations which were already suffering previously have their situations have worsened. They will talk about how some of these locations in the cities, the waste management has deep down improved, but they don't reveal the entirety of the story, that yes, some of the locations from waste are daily cleaned, are actually taken away and not processed ethically, but dumped into some other locations which are far, far away from the accessibility of the common people, or let's say as tourists or visitors, right? And that is where you see these selective problematic representations, is where you see that the media, the social media or the news media or any other form of media, plays a deep down essential role to trigger the challenge, the problem of Garbo politics across the country. In fact, a similar sort of situation, I can also, give examples from Bangalore as well, where you see that caste and, regional belongingness plays a deep down essential role in the form of enclaving the locations, and also then initiating the very differentiated waste management practices in the localities. Why municipalities feel that some localities need to be cleaned on a daily basis and some localities can be systemically ignored in the process is very much deeply entrenched in the questions of caste, in the question of religion, in the question of regionality, and many other perspectives that can be taken into consideration. In fact, I remember one more example from the city of Kolkata before I move into sort of outside India to talk about how refugees and migrants and garbage and the media, they sort of kind of intertwined with each other. So again Kolkata, a locality not very far from my own locality. It's called Shodhpur. Again, those who are familiar with Kolkata and its places in its slightly in its outskirts are kind of familiar. And when I use the word outskirts, obviously I use in the geographical sense, just to be very clear in the process. So when you look at these geographical outskirts of the city, there is this place called Shodhpur. In one of these localities of Shodhpur, recently I was there to do some field visit, get some photos, do some walk arounds related to my research on waste and culture and all of these perspectives. And then I go into this one particular locality, obviously for ethical reasons, I'm not taking the name. So I go to this one particular locality, and one of my very dear friends, she is one of those localities, and she takes me around to see the different things that I wanted to see around. And there in that particular locality, you see that all the houses dump their waste right in front of them. And obviously, I was again very disgusted to see this, and I asked them that why would you do that? I mean, at the least basis, it is causing so much of hygienic damage to you. And they would say that the municipality never ever cares to come and collect our waste. Where should we dump these waste? Despite several times they are supposed to come every day, it is their responsibility to come and collect the waste materials from our respective houses, but they never ever turn up. Ample of complaints, raising concerns, protests, everything fell into deaf ears. So what they have to do is, for them, the temporary option is dump those waste in front. Once it starts stinking and accumulating in huge numbers, start burning them off. Now, this has been the regular process that have been ongoing. Now, usually what happens, if we are not knowing the background of this particular story, if we don't get a scope to interact with these kind of people who are suffering on a daily basis, and let's imagine we just walk into this place and then we look around, we feel disgusted, and by default our idea would be, oh well, these people are so unconcerned, or these people are so ignorant, like they just destroy their own locality. But the reality of the story is kind of quite different. A similar kind of thing can be applied with the instances that I shared in the context of Varanasi as well, where you see that if we don't know the reality, the different political and the social and the communal layers of the reality behind the accumulation and disposal of waste in very particular locations, then by default, and this is a kind of narrative, I'm sure if not everybody, many of us have been brought up with this narrative that a certain community is always being labeled as, oh, they are very unhygienic, don't mix with them a lot, oh, they are very dirty, don't get into their localities, or don't share your lunch boxes with them because they might feed you with something which is very unhygienic, right? This narrative of dirt, hatred, waste being sort of tagged with certain communities, certain localities, certain specialities has always been an inherent part of our history and culture. It's not that it is happening something new. Today, under these sort of academic paradigms, today in an era of social media, we are looking into these challenges so categorically, so impactfully, but then these problems were always there. So when we take this historical backdrop, when we take the contemporary scenarios, when we try to join them together, when we see the ignorance of the media, we see that it is basically those historical narratives of hatred and disgust against certain cultures, communities, their ways of existence that were deeply entrenched within us, within across different spans of time, are just being recycled in the contemporary times in these forms and formats. And that is where, again, garbo politics, or the politics of garbage, comes into function. Similarly, as I say that I'll slightly go outside the avenue of India, because also I was, and this whatever I'm sharing with you are all stories that I have documented through travel, stories that I have documented through my working there, staying there, interacting with the people, and engaging with multiple levels of ethnographic and auto-ethnographic experiences. Now, in Bhutan, when I was staying, I worked there for 2 years. Bhutan, interestingly, as we all know, has has a very interesting geopolitical feature. When every country are talking about, gross national index or these kind of measuring criteria, one of the famous things about Bhutan is gross national happiness. As a measuring criteria of understanding the development of a country. And an essential part of gross national happiness is respectability and the preservation of the natural environment. So the country is officially 62% of forest cover. That's an official forest cover, which basically means that the humans, for them to live, function, establish industries, or whatever they want to do for the humans, they only have 38% of geographical area. And that is they occupy for housing, for whatever vegetation, for education, for industries, and whatever they do. But interestingly, this sort of narrative, or the governmental narrative of the gross national happiness, is not really applicable for every community. Now, in Bhutan, there is a minority, and again, I'm using the term minority just to be very clear in terms of numbers and also in terms of their cultural valuability. Uh, there is a group of Nepali refugees who have been staying in Bhutan since the 1960s, when Nepal was undergoing a series of internal conflicts, within their own imperial powers. At that time, a lot of Nepalis escaped the political wrath from their country, and they came to Bhutan. And that is why, if we go to the eastern Bhutan's lowland or western Bhutan's lowland areas, if we visit those lowland areas, we will very interestingly see that they are widely occupied by the Nepali refugees. Obviously, the families of the Nepali refugees who once came there back in the 1960s. Now, they're known by these terms, Loth Shampas. Okay, I'll again just write it down before I explain what exactly it means. They're known by the term Loth Shampas. Now, the Loth Shampas means, if it is roughly translated into English, it means that the lowland residents. But then, if we look at the patterns and the cultures of the implementation of this particular term, we see that Loth Shampa is basically used as a synonym to designate the Nepali refugee community as outsiders, a term used to designate, to mock them, to abuse them, and to always make them realize that no matter how many years, for how many years they are staying in the country, no matter whatever residential permits and documents they have, still they would be treated as cultural outsiders of the country. And that can be seen very systemically in terms of the representation in the parliament, in terms of the representation in the government, in terms of the representation in the job sectors, in terms of their cultural representations, in terms of their educational representations. You take multiple examples and you will, if you closely observe, you will see that there are very few in numbers who are kind of allowed to sort of come into the mainstream social space. And that is where, and now, also very interestingly, if we look at the waste management, now coming to a different segment, if you look at the waste management problem in Bhutan, and if you stay there, especially if you are staying in the eastern parts of Bhutan, you will see a usual narrative that floats around And the usual narrative is that, these people, these Nepali refugees, they're fine, but they are very deep down responsible for causing a lot of environmental damage. They are responsible for illegally cutting down trees. They are responsible for high level of drug uses. They are responsible for generating waste and choking our natural environment. So these sort of narratives are very commonly used across the country in our daily life conversations. And this, where you see, when you listen to the interactions, you try to look through the styles and the stylistics of interactions, then you realize that they are not the complaints or the concerns that are being raised are not just restricted on the problem that they're trying to flag off. It's also deep down entrenched in the very historical pattern of treating these Loth Shampas as discards, as waste, as someone who are not considered as much of an importance in the country, or who are just being allowed to stay in the country just out of mere sympathy, right? So you can associate, because honestly, waste problem, obviously in those locations where the Loth Shampas exist, waste problem is there, but waste problem is rising like any other part of the world in different other parts of Bhutan as well. It's rising, it's gradually rising. The country is genuinely concerned, the government, the people are genuinely concerned. So why particularly it is essential to flag off a particular community, their history, their culture, to talk about or to engage with a problem which is a pan-national problem. Similar questions can be raised why it is essential to flag off low-caste people or Muslim people or any other such kind of marginalized communities to understand the problem of rising waste and unhealthiness and unhygiene in a country when it is a pan-national concern. And when we raise these questions, we are not just raising cultural questions, we are not just raising social questions, we are also raising deep down political questions. We are directly targeting, pointing out to the concerns of Garbo politics, or the politics of garbage. We are trying to historically investigate, we are trying to historically, unlayer to understand that how waste has always been a very intersectional perspective. It's not just about, although we are sort of habituated to understand it as something which is very physical, something which is very objective, something which is very tangible, but then it was never like that. It's been on our side. It's our failure that we have actually, failed to understand waste in that particular dimension. And similar thing, just another major example that I would also like to point out very categorically out here is when a similar kind of experience from a racial dynamics where certain racial communities have been historically treated as waste is when I was in South Africa for 2 years, being in Johannesburg, where you go around, go into this particular city where you see some of these pockets which are architecturally so fanciful that you feel like you're walking down one of those cobbled pathways in a very posh region of Europe or in a very historically significant region of Europe. And the very next moment you come out of those pockets, you see that overflowing hydrants, openly people sitting out into the streets and injecting themselves with drugs. Unfortunately, individuals begging around for food, for clothes, people unable to, work, they are looking for work. So you also see an immediate contradistinctive picture right behind those locations, which are so posh, full of branded shops and cafeterias and fancy people in their fancy dresses coming and enjoying and having their own hay time. Just behind those locations, you see these so-called problematic sectors. And that is where you see an immediate contrast that how some people, some communities, some cultures matter over the other, how some cultures are worth celebrating, and how some sort of cultures are worth discarding. But to what extent do we see their questions and their representations in the media? Obviously, on the social media, we would see that people coming up and flagging off the concerns, often with photos and videos and all of these perspectives. But then the social media like Facebook, and we all have these, I believe that we all have this concern across, where they have their own problematic, extremely hierarchical, extremely racial, extremely propagandist algorithms. These social media spaces have these algorithms which immediately makes one of your very significant posts as against their ethical guidelines, as against their ethical standards and social standards. So on the one side, we do see influential individuals from influential political parties coming up and openly spreading communal hatred, cultural hatred, showing their open disgust against communities, against societies, against cultures without being called off, rather being celebrated in a frenzied manner. And when people are resisting against that, often those narratives of resistances are sort of called off, shut down, removed, in the name of your post has violated the ethical guidelines. And that is where you see that the how the social media itself is operates like a garbage. It itself operates like a waste with its very wasteful standards, with very wasteful ideologies, with very wasteful perspectives, and how silently, structurally, systemically it sort of triggers these already existing hatred and disgust that exist within the communities. And when I use the word communities, obviously I'm not just talking of the human communities, I'm also talking about the human and the more than human living civilizations at the same time. And in South Africa, again, you will see that some of these usual narratives that people would complain about waste and garbage accumulation and waste management is not proper. But all of these complaints are getting highlighted from which localities? The localities that are widely, predominantly occupied by the white people, the localities predominantly occupied by the influential politicians or influential people from across the social strata, the localities which are deep down extremely elitist, occupied by the extreme elite class of people. So again, the question, who matters, who doesn't matter, and these are the things that will surely get flagged off in the media. And obviously, if the complaints are being raised by a very influential group of people, then I mean, doubtlessly, you will see that those complaints are getting a first page news in the newspapers, or worst case, a second page news in the newspapers. But then, when these kind of complaints, worse, even worse kind of situations are being raised by people from other localities, you don't see that. And why? Because they are mainly the localities that are consisting of population, the migrant population, the refugee population. You will see that there is this one place called Fordsburg in Johannesburg, which is a very interesting, you see interesting cultural mix there, because a huge number of refugees and migrants from across South Asia, Eastern Africa, North Africa, West Asia, some are runaway, some are political refugees, some are climate refugees, some are migrants who have come here in search of a better work opportunity. They all sort of stay together with each other, but these locations don't matter, because historically refugees don't matter, historically migrants don't matter. They are just like discards. And do we really need to give very categorical and specific examples? I believe not. I mean, just look at the US-Mexico border, the history of the refugees in the US-Mexico border. Let us talk about the Myanmar-Bangladesh, Myanmar-India border, India-Bangladesh border, India-Pakistan border, ample and ample, or refugees across aquatic ways, huge loads of refugees going to Greece and Turkey and Spain and other parts of Europe and other parts of the world on a daily basis. So we have ample and ample of examples where refugees would be hurdled like, just like garbage, we put in one plastic packet and just hurl it off. You will see that is how the refugees and the migrants are treated. in fact, just I mean, why we shouldn't take into account how Donald Trump has sent these Indians back to India. Just look at the very presence and the method of sending, hands tied, heads down, as if they are criminals. As if they are criminals. Like there is not a little iron of humanity. And then look at the media reports. Now, when the Indians, their hands are tied, when the hands of the Sudanese people are tied, when the hands of the Mexican people are tied, then that doesn't become a racial issue. Just imagine it is happening with white people from white nation. Immediately it will become a racial issue. That is why the Ukraine-Russia war can be a racial issue, but then the Syrian war, then the Iraqi war doesn't become a racial issue. You look at the way systemically the media on a daily basis are consistently producing these sort of narratives, which actually has been historically reducing certain communities, certain cultures, certain societies, certain ideologies into waste, while other community problem, other social problem, other cultural problems need to be sort of always highlighted through the media. And that is where you see the Garbo-Politics of media. That is where you see the media as a form of garbage. And then we can take endless examples, endless sort of narratives. But now the question is, having shared so many instances that categorically points out that how the media, triggers these sort of spaces or incentivizes or maintains very structurally these sort of spaces where consistently, communities are becoming, some communities need to be celebrated while other communities become waste. How do we sort of question these locations? How do we sort of interrogate these locations? Obviously, here I am not here, and honestly, I'm not capable to sit here across 2 hours and collectively brainstorm and bring a solution. There is no, honestly, there are no immediate solution to them. But then that doesn't should not prevent us from asking these kind of relevant questions, because obviously if we are talking about challenges, if we are talking about these issues, even before trying to find out relevant solutions, we do have to look into the relevant roots of the problems. And these questions that I'm trying to raise with all of us, these loud thinking that I'm trying to do with all of us, are some of the ways in which we need to raise these questions. Because if you're not asking the right questions, we're not identifying the right problems. And if you're not identifying the right problems, we keep on, circling and circling and circling with multiple rules and regulations and pacts and pledges, and nothing really happens in the practical front, right? One way of doing that is to sort of understand our